Sophia Carter stepped into the grand lobby of Crestwood Financial, adjusting the strap of her handbag as the cool air of the bank sent a slight shiver down her spine. The scent of freshly brewed coffee from the self-serve station mixed with the faint polish of the marble floors, creating an atmosphere of prestige. She checked her watch, 2:45 p.m. She had more than enough time to resolve the issue with her account before the bank closed at 4 o'clock. As she approached the reception desk, a young blonde woman in a crisp navy blazer barely acknowledged her, eyes glued to her computer screen. "Good afternoon, I need to speak with." "Take a seat. Someone will be with you shortly," the woman interrupted without looking up. Sophia took a deep breath and sat down. Minutes passed. Then 30. Then nearly an hour. Meanwhile, others, mostly younger, well-dressed professionals, were helped immediately. When a well-groomed woman in a designer handbag walked in, the same receptionist brightened instantly, calling for the manager right away. Sophia's stomach twisted. She had seen this before. Then, the doors swung open, and a group of executives entered. The leader, a distinguished black man, scanned the room and suddenly beamed. "Sophia Carter," he called, striding toward her. "It's been too long." The entire bank went silent. The same manager who had ignored her stiffened. Sophia realized in that moment, she was no longer invisible. And whatever had been keeping her in the shadows was about to come to light. The question was she ready for the truth to finally be seen? Sophia Carter sat in the stiff leather chair of Crestwood Financial's lobby, her patience wearing thin as she glanced at the clock on the far wall, 3:15 p.m. She had been waiting for over 30 minutes. When she first walked in, she had been polite, professional, and prepared to handle a simple issue with her account. But now, as she watched person after person get helped ahead of her, she realized something deeper was at play. At first, she tried to brush it off. Maybe the manager was genuinely busy. Maybe it was just a particularly chaotic afternoon at the bank. But it was getting harder to ignore the obvious. The people being helped immediately all seemed to have one thing in common. They didn't look like her. Sophia straightened in her chair and studied the interactions around her. A man in a gray suit had entered nearly 20 minutes after she did, and within moments, the receptionist greeted him with a bright smile. "Mr. Reynolds. Let me call the manager for you right away." Not 5 minutes later, the bank manager himself appeared, shaking the man's hand warmly before escorting him to a private office. Sophia clenched her hands in her lap, forcing herself to remain composed. She had been given a very different reception. When she first approached the receptionist, a young blonde woman in a crisp navy blazer, the woman barely looked up. She had dismissed Sophia with a single, uninterested glance and told her to sit and wait. Now, nearly 45 minutes had passed, and Sophia was still waiting. Her frustration deepened and a woman in a chic black dress and high heels walked in, carrying a designer handbag. The receptionist's entire demeanor shifted, she sat up straighter, her tone turned warm and inviting. "Welcome. How can we assist you today?" 2 minutes later, the bank manager appeared, shaking the woman's hand, leading her inside just like he had done with the man before. Sophia inhaled slowly, her heart pounding in quiet indignation. She scanned the room again. Nearly every other customer, all of whom were white, had been helped without hesitation. She, however, had been completely ignored. This wasn't just bad service. This was something else entirely. Enough was enough. Sophia rose from her chair, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor as she approached the reception desk once again. She kept her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me. I was told I would be seen soon, but I've been waiting for nearly an hour while others who arrived after me have already been assisted. Can you explain why? The receptionist barely glanced up, her lips pressing into a thin line. The manager is very busy right now. You'll just have to wait your turn, ma'am. That ma'am, clipped, dismissive, felt like a slap. Sophia exhaled sharply, biting back the frustration bubbling to the surface. My turn should have come a long time ago, she replied evenly. The receptionist's expression remained unchanged, but there was a glint in her eye, an almost smug indifference. Would you like me to schedule an appointment for another day? She asked, her voice syrupy sweet, as if Sophia was nothing more than an inconvenience. Sophia's pulse quickened. She had been professional, patient, and composed. And still, she was being brushed aside as if she didn't matter. A sudden movement caught her attention. The bank manager, clipboard in hand, stepped out of his office, scanning the lobby. His eyes flicked over Sophia as if she were invisible before landing on a middle-aged couple who had just entered. His entire demeanor shifted. With a broad smile, he strode toward them. Mr. and Mrs. Holloway, it's so good to see you again. Let's get you all set up, shall we? Sophia felt her stomach drop. She had done everything right. She had been respectful, patient, and professional. And yet, she was being treated as if she didn't exist. She had seen this before. The subtle but crushing disregard. The unspoken hierarchy that determined who was worth acknowledging and who wasn't. And she was tired of it. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, but she willed herself to remain calm. If she had learned anything over the years, it was that standing up for yourself wasn't just about making noise, it was about making sure you were heard. Sophia took a slow breath, steadied herself, and prepared to speak again. Because if there was one thing she refused to be today, it was invisible. Sophia Carter sat in a stiff leather chair of Crestwood Financial, her frustration mounting with each passing minute. She had spent nearly an hour waiting while customers who arrived after her were assisted immediately. The quiet, unspoken hierarchy was clear: certain people were seen, acknowledged, and prioritized, while others, like her, were made to wait indefinitely. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain composed. But just as she was about to rise and demand to be seen, the doors to the bank swung open. A group of 4 executives strode in, their presence shifting the very energy of the room. They carried themselves with quiet authority, dressed in sleek business suits, their movements purposeful. The leader of the group, a distinguished black man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, scanned the lobby with sharp, assessing eyes. Then, to Sophia's absolute shock, his face lit up with recognition. Sophia Carter, he called out, his voice deep and commanding, carrying easily across the hushed room. I was hoping we'd run into you today. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. Heads turned. The receptionist, who had barely looked at Sophia before, stiffened in her chair. The bank manager, Daniel Whitman, who had ignored her for nearly an hour, hesitated at the doorway of his office, his clipboard clutched tightly in his hands. His knuckles whitened. Sophia barely had time to process what was happening before the group of executives approached her. The man who had called her name extended his hand with a warm, confident smile. It's been too long, he said, shaking her hand firmly. How have you been? Sophia blinked, momentarily stunned. She had met many professionals over the years, but in that moment, she struggled to place him. Before she could respond, she felt the weight of the room shift. Every customer, every employee, even the receptionist, now had their eyes locked on her. The same woman who had dismissed her earlier was suddenly frozen, fingers still resting on her keyboard, but her focus was now entirely on Sophia. And then, as if waking from a trance, Daniel Whitman stepped forward, clearing his throat. His smile was forced, his eyes darting between Sophia and the executive standing before her. "Mr. Langston," he said smoothly, finally recognizing the man. "What a pleasure to see you again." Sophia's breath hitched. "Langston?" Her mind clicked into place. Thomas Langston, senior board member overseeing Crestwood Financial's regional operations. A man whose signature alone could determine the fate of entire branches. A man with real power. And he had greeted her first. Whitman's carefully composed expression faltered. He had spent the last hour dismissing Sophia, treating her like she wasn't worth his time. Now, the reality of his mistake was setting in. Langston turned slightly, regarding the bank manager with a cool, unreadable expression. He didn't extend his hand. Instead, his gaze swept over the lobby, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. "I didn't realize you banked here, Sophia," Langston said, turning back to her. "How's the service?" The room held its breath. Sophia knew exactly what he was asking. This wasn't just small talk. Langston wasn't simply checking on her banking experience, he was giving her the floor. Giving her the opportunity to speak the truth. For so long, she had been overlooked. Dismissed. Treated as if she was invisible. Now, she wasn't just being asked a simple question. She was being seen. Sophia took a deep breath, holding her ground as the weight of the moment settled on her shoulders. She met Langston's gaze, then glanced at Whitman, whose expression had turned noticeably pale. She knew the power dynamics in the room had just been upended. It was her move now. And she wasn't going to waste it. For the first time in nearly an hour, every eye in the bank was on Sophia Carter. Moments ago, she had been just another customer, overlooked, dismissed, and made to wait while others were welcomed with warm smiles and immediate service. But now, with Thomas Langston, a senior board member of Crestwood Financial, standing before her, everything had changed. His question still hung in the air, "How's the service?" It wasn't just small talk. He was giving her the stage, offering her the chance to expose the truth. The truth that, until now, had been easy for the bank staff to ignore. Sophia's heart pounded, but she wasn't nervous. She was ready. She straightened her posture, her voice calm but firm. "I've been here for almost an hour," she began. "I walked in, just like every other customer, expecting to be helped. Instead, I was told to sit and wait. And wait. While others, who arrived long after I did, were immediately seen by a manager." A tense silence settled over the room. Langston's expression remained unreadable, but Sophia could see something shift in his eyes, a quiet understanding. She continued, her words measured but filled with an undeniable weight. "I watched as people who looked a certain way, who fit the right image, were greeted with smiles, ushered inside within minutes. Meanwhile, I was treated like an afterthought. As if my time, my business, didn't matter." From the corner of her eye, she saw Daniel Whitman, the bank manager, standing rigid near the entrance to his office, his jaw tightening. He knew exactly what she was saying. And more importantly, so did everyone else in the room. Sophia took a steady breath and turned her gaze toward the receptionist, who sat frozen behind her desk. The same woman who had dismissed her with barely a glance had all but leaped to her feet to assist other customers who happened to be younger, wealthier looking, and, notably, white. Sophia let her next words hang in the air. "This isn't just bad service." She paused, letting the weight of what she was about to say settle. "This is discrimination." A hushed murmur rippled through the lobby. Whitman took a half step forward, as if he wanted to interject, but he stopped himself. There was no talking his way out of this. Not now. Not with Langston watching. Sophia met Langston's gaze again. "I don't care how busy a manager is," she said, her voice unwavering. "Every customer deserves to be treated with respect. And today, I was not." She felt her pulse quicken, but she didn't let it show. This moment wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or treated as if they didn't belong. Langston turned, his sharp eyes locking onto Whitman. "Is this how you run your branch, Daniel?" His voice was calm, almost too calm. But the undercurrent of disappointment was unmistakable. Whitman opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His carefully constructed composure was cracking under the weight of the truth. Sophia held her breath as Langston looked around the room. He saw the unease in the staff, the lingering stares from the other customers, the way the entire atmosphere had shifted. And then, he nodded. "Thank you for your honesty, Sophia," he said. "I can see exactly what's been happening here." Sophia exhaled slowly. She had said what needed to be said. And for the first time in hours, she felt seen. Truly seen. A heavy silence settled over the bank lobby, the kind that only follows an undeniable truth. Sophia Carter had spoken, had laid bare the discrimination she had endured. And now, every person in the room was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Thomas Langston, the senior board member of Crestwood Financial, kept his gaze firmly on Daniel Whitman, the branch manager who had so easily dismissed Sophia earlier. "Is this how you run your branch, Daniel?" Langston's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in his tone. Whitman swallowed, his carefully constructed mask of composure slipping. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but for the first time since this all began, he had no words. Sophia remained still, her hands resting at her sides, but inside, she felt something shift. She had seen people like Whitman dodge accountability before, making excuses, shifting blame, dismissing concerns. But not this time. Langston turned slightly, exchanging a glance with the other executives who had accompanied him. A silent understanding passed between them. Then, he looked back at Whitman. "This isn't the first time we've heard complaints about your leadership." Whitman stiffened. His face paled slightly. Langston exhaled, shaking his head. "And now, we've seen it firsthand." The weight of his words seemed to hit Whitman like a hammer. I can assure you, Mr. Langston," Whitman stammered, "this was simply a misunderstanding. Our staff is—" Langston held up a hand, cutting him off. "Enough." The single word carried more finality than any long-winded reprimand ever could. A murmur rippled through the bank. The receptionist, who had once dismissed Sophia without a second thought, was now staring down at her keyboard, her fingers motionless. The other bank employees, who had so easily ignored the situation before, now stood still, their expressions tense. Sophia watched as Whitman's confidence crumbled before her eyes. He wasn't just being scolded. He was being removed. Langston turned to one of the executives behind him, a woman in a sleek navy suit with an air of quiet authority. "Start the process." She nodded, already pulling out her phone. Whitman's hands curled into fists at his sides, his desperation barely masked now. "You're firing me? Over one incident?" Langston raised an eyebrow. "One incident? No, Daniel. This was the final straw." Whitman opened his mouth again, but this time, he seemed to realize there was nothing he could say. Sophia felt something she hadn't expected: vindication. She had spent nearly an hour being ignored, treated like she was invisible. And yet, now, the very people who had dismissed her were being forced to reckon with their actions. Justice had been slow, but it had arrived. Langston turned back to Sophia. His voice softened just slightly. "Thank you for speaking up," he said. "People like you remind us why accountability matters." Sophia nodded, feeling a deep sense of relief settle over her. For once, silence hadn't won. She had been seen. She had been heard. And now, change was finally happening. The tension in the room had begun to settle, though the weight of what had just happened still lingered in the air. Daniel Whitman, the branch manager of Crestwood Financial, stood frozen near his office, his career slipping through his fingers in real time. The executives had made it clear, his leadership was no longer acceptable. But Sophia Carter wasn't thinking about him anymore. For the first time since she had stepped into the bank that afternoon, she felt something shift, a sense of empowerment she hadn't expected. She had stood her ground, spoken the truth, and now, the very institution that had dismissed her was being forced to confront its flaws. As the murmurs in the bank continued, Thomas Langston, the senior board member who had been the catalyst for this moment, turned back to her. "Sophia," he said, his tone noticeably warmer than before, "may I have a word with you in private?" Sophia hesitated for only a second before nodding. She followed Langston and the other executives into a sleek conference room, its walls lined with framed awards boasting the bank's commitment to excellence. The irony wasn't lost on her. Langston gestured for her to take a seat. Across the table, one of the other executives, a woman named Miriam Lewis, pulled out a notepad and spoke first. "First," she said, her voice calm but firm, "we want to sincerely apologize for what you experienced today. Unfortunately, this isn't the first report we've received about disparities in service at this branch, but yours is the most blatant case we've witnessed in real time." Sophia folded her hands in her lap. "I don't need an apology," she said honestly. "I need to know that something will actually change." Miriam exchanged a look with Langston, then nodded. "That's exactly why we're here." Langston leaned forward, his hands clasped. "We're restructuring leadership at this branch. Whitman was already on thin ice, and today only confirmed what we've been hearing. We need to rebuild trust, both with our customers and our employees." Sophia listened carefully, unsure of where this was going. Langston paused, then tilted his head slightly. "Tell me, Sophia, have you ever considered a career in finance?" Sophia blinked. That was the last thing she expected to hear. "Finance," she echoed. Miriam smiled slightly. "We're not just looking to replace Whitman with another version of him. We want someone who understands what it means to serve a community. Someone who values people, not just numbers." She tapped her pen against her notepad. "Someone like you." Sophia's breath caught. "You're asking if I'd be interested in a position here?" Langston nodded. "Not necessarily at this location, but yes. We think you'd be an asset." Sophia sat back in her chair, trying to process the enormity of what was being offered. She had walked into this bank expecting to fight just to be acknowledged, to be treated with basic respect. Now, she was being asked to step into a role where she could reshape how the system worked. It was a lot to take in. I don't know," she admitted. "I've never thought about working in banking before." Miriam leaned forward. "That's actually why you'd be good at it. You're not part of the system that let Whitman thrive. You'd be coming in with a fresh perspective, one that puts customers first." Langston nodded. "And if people like you don't step into positions of power, then people like Whitman continue to control how things operate." Sophia exhaled slowly, glancing down at the polished table beneath her fingertips. She thought about all the times she had seen injustices play out, all the times she had been told to just accept things as they were. What if, instead of fighting the system from the outside, she could change it from within? "I need time to think about it," she finally said. Langston smiled, as if he had expected that answer. "Of course," he said. "Take all the time you need. Just know this, we're serious about making real change. And we think you could be a part of that." Sophia nodded, still processing everything. As she walked out of the conference room and back through the lobby, she felt the stares of those who had witnessed what had unfolded. The receptionist, who had dismissed her earlier, now sat stiffly, avoiding her gaze. Other customers, some of whom had been served before her, watched her with something that almost resembled admiration. Sophia stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the sunlight warming her face. She had come to the bank expecting to be overlooked. Instead, she was walking away with a chance to create real change. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something powerful. Hope. Sophia Carter sat at her kitchen table, staring at the offer in front of her. It had been 2 days since she walked out of Crestwood Financial, leaving behind a shaken branch manager and a boardroom full of executives eager for change. But now, the decision rested with her. Could she really step into a leadership role at the very institution that had dismissed her? She had spent her life fighting against systems that quietly pushed people like her to the margins. It was exhausting. It was frustrating. And yet, when given the opportunity to take a seat at the table, to be the one making decisions, she found herself hesitating. Would she be able to change the system from within? Or would she just become another cog in the machine? She thought back to the moment in the bank when she had spoken up. When she had refused to be overlooked. When her voice had finally been heard. That moment had set something in motion, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated as less than. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she landed on Jordan's name. He had always been the person she turned to in moments like this. "You already know the answer, Sophia," he said the moment he picked up. "You don't just want things to change. You need them to. And now, you have the chance to make that happen." She closed her eyes, letting the words settle in. By the time she called Thomas Langston back, her voice was steady. "I've thought it over," she said. "And I'm ready to accept the offer." In life, it's easy to feel overlooked, to sit in a waiting room, a workplace, or even in conversations where your presence is acknowledged but your worth is not. Sophia Carter's story reminds us that silence is not the answer. When she refused to be dismissed, she didn't just change her own experience, she forced the system to recognize its flaws. For many of us, especially those who have lived long enough to see injustice repeat itself, it can be tempting to believe that speaking up won't make a difference. But change doesn't happen by waiting for the world to be fair, it happens when we demand it. When we choose to stand up, not just for ourselves but for those who come after us, we redefine what's possible. And sometimes, the greatest act of courage isn't just calling out what's wrong, it's stepping into the spaces where decisions are made and making sure they're done right. Because real change doesn't come from the sidelines. It comes from those who refuse to be invisible. No matter your age, your voice still has power. Use it.